In this video, I will discuss 4 of my favorite examples of augmented sixth chords from the music of Haydn and Mozart. These chords are so named because they contain the interval of an augmented sixth that resolves outwardly up a half step and down a half step to the root of the dominant chord. The 3 most common types of augmented sixth chords have easy-to-remember nicknames: Italian, French, and German, though the origins of these descriptors are unknown, and they don't seem to have any significance beyond giving us a convenient label for each version. The Italian augmented sixth chord adds only one note to the augmented sixth interval, the root of the tonic chord, in this case a C because we're in C major. The French augmented sixth chord is just an Italian augmented sixth chord with an added note a whole tone above the root of the tonic, in this case a D because we're in C major. And finally, the German augmented sixth chord is also just an Italian augmented sixth chord with one additional note. But this time it's a minor third above the root of the tonic, in this case an E flat because we're in C major. Notice that with the German augmented sixth chord, this progression contains parallel fifths. Both Mozart and Haydn sometimes just ignored this as a problem altogether, but more commonly they solved it by following the German augmented sixth chord with a cadential 6/4 instead of going directly to the dominant. This allows the augmented sixth interval to resolve outwardly to the same 2 notes an octave apart, but the problem note instead resolves up, thus avoiding the parallel fifths. Before I introduce the first Mozart passage, I should mention that all 4 of the examples I chose for this video are variants of the following very specific progression, a favorite of composers from this era, that begins with a surprise deceptive cadence to the flat 6 chord, or in the minor mode just the 6 chord, that eventually becomes a German augmented sixth chord with the addition of the top note. This specific progression is actually what this video is about, but I didn't want to scare away potential viewers with a title like this. My first example comes from the end of the rondo finale of Mozart's masterful G minor piano quartet, K478. The movement itself is in G major and begins with this cheerful theme. The final return of this rondo theme at the end of the movement is introduced by imitative entries of the theme itself from the strings, accompanied by this prolonged trill from the piano. This builds to a cadence that could easily have been the final 5/1 cadence of the piece, but instead we hear a dramatic surprise deceptive cadence to the flat 6 chord, E flat major, with suddenly quiet imitative entries of the theme in E flat major. The flat 6 chord eventually becomes a German augmented sixth chord that resolves to a cadential 6/4 chord, as I mentioned before, to avoid parallel fifths. Pay attention to the outward resolution of the 2 notes that form the augmented sixth interval in this chord. This chord progression now returns to the tonic to conclude the piece with these virtuosic triplets from the piano, and final entries of the rondo theme from the strings. My second example comes at the end of the extraordinary Adagio second movement of Haydn's Opus 54 No. 2 string quartet in C major. I already included this astonishing passage in this primitive compilation video from 2013, but now I hope to do it a little more justice. This remarkable movement in the parallel C minor is based on this mysterious theme that's almost more of a repeating ground bass, over which the first violin plays this incredible, seemingly improvisatory material. At the end of the movement, we hear one of my favorite moments in Haydn's entire output, when this dominant chord leads to a surprising deceptive cadence to the sixth chord. However, the leading tone in the first violin refuses to resolve with the other voices, instead becoming a dissonant non-chord tone, in this case a retardation, that Haydn emphasizes by repeating 4 times. The sixth chord now becomes a German augmented sixth chord that resolves to a 5 chord in the next measure, but notice that only the cello resolves on the downbeat, and the other 3 instruments have dissonant retardations before also resolving to the 5 chord on the next beat. Also notice that the minuet and trio third movement in C major is immediately played attacca to resolve the dominant chord that ends this bizarre and singular movement. For my third example, I chose the final movement of Mozart's K465 string quartet in C major, also known as the Dissonance Quartet because of the spectacular dissonances in the slow introduction of its first movement. The final movement begins with this light-hearted theme, and notice that the theme itself uses this French augmented sixth chord, though this isn't the one I'm going to discuss. After the second theme in the dominant key of G major, the first violin launches into this humorous, virtuosic passage with these sforzati, leading to these 2 measures when everything seems to slow down as the 3 other instruments momentarily drop out completely. We now hear the surprising sudden shift to the flat 6 chord, though now probably expected in the context of this video. Mozart now introduces a completely new theme in E flat, and although for simplicity's sake I'm labeling this as an extended flat 6 chord, it's probably better to consider it a brief modulation to the key of E flat, since each measure alternates between E flat major and its dominant chord B flat major, and if repeating a 5-1 cadence 4 times doesn't tonicize E flat major, I'm not sure what would. In any event, after this brief excursion, Mozart returns to G major with this Italian augmented sixth chord that, although the notes never sound simultaneously, can also be heard as a French or German augmented sixth chord. I guess just for fun we could call it an international augmented sixth chord. This now progresses in the expected manner back to G major to end the exposition section. This material returns in the recapitulation section as an even more extraordinary expanded version of what we heard in the exposition. This time, since the recapitulation remains in C major, the surprise green theme enters in A-flat major, and the A-flat major chord eventually becomes the international augmented sixth chord we heard before. To understand what happens next, we have to realize that German augmented sixth chords are often used as pivot chords in modulations, since they are the enharmonic equivalents of dominant seventh chords, meaning they sound exactly the same but are spelled differently depending on the function. For example, this is the progression we've already heard multiple times, with the German augmented sixth chord leading us back to the dominant chord we started with. If instead we respell the top F sharp as its enharmonic equivalent, G flat, it becomes a 5/7 chord tonicizing the new key of D flat major. This is the exact technique Mozart now uses when, instead of immediately resolving to the expected key of C major to end the movement, we hear another deceptive cadence to the flat 6 chord, immediately followed by a chord that sounds like another German augmented sixth chord, especially given what just happened 4 bars prior to this. But looking at the score with the F sharp from the prior augmented sixth chord respelled as a G flat, you can probably guess that this is a 5/7 chord about to tonicize the even more distant key of D flat major. In this new key, the surprise green theme now enters as imitative counterpoint between the cello and first violin. Now, a slightly more complicated modulation is required to return to the final key of C major, but it ends with the same progression we've already heard, starting with this German augmented sixth chord, leading back to the tonic. For the final example in this video, I chose one of my favorite symphonic movements by Haydn, the final fourth movement of his 86th Symphony in D major, one of his 6 Paris symphonies. Typical of Haydn, the movement begins with this seemingly frivolous, amusing theme that later becomes the basis of a brilliant masterpiece. Notice that it begins with these 5 staccato repeated eighth notes. After the expected modulation to A major, this even more humorous second theme enters. Notice that it begins with the same 5 staccato repeated eighth notes. This movement is another of Haydn's monothematic sonata forms, in which all the themes are some variant of the opening theme. Watch my prior analysis of the finale of his Opus 74 No. 1 quartet for another amazing example of this. At the end of the hilarious second theme, we hear this more energetic orange transitional figure that leads to the closing theme played first by just the wind instruments, another variant of the opening theme with the same repeated notes. Notice that when it repeats, it's now accompanied by these aggressive accented 16th note figures played by the cellos and contrabasses. This leads to the end of the exposition section, and notice that even the transition to the repeat is based on the original repeated notes. The passage I chose for this video occurs near the end of the recapitulation section, so I was originally going to skip over the development section, but I couldn't resist including its ingenious final portion, and since it also uses an augmented sixth chord, I feel justified. Up to this point, the development has mostly featured the purple theme that eventually modulates to B minor with the help of this German augmented sixth chord that resolves to the dominant chord. This introduces one of my favorite intense bouts of counterpoint, when the whole orchestra plays the original green theme as a 2-part canon at the interval of a perfect fifth, quickly modulating back to the D major beginning of the recapitulation. The recapitulation section now proceeds mostly as expected until the moment I want to discuss at the end of the second purple theme. Instead of continuing directly to the energetic orange transitional figure, as we saw in the exposition section, we now hear a surprise fortissimo deceptive cadence to the flat 6 chord, B flat major, with intense entries of the green theme. This eventually becomes a prolonged German augmented sixth chord, with the entries of the green theme further intensified with relentless hammering of the repeated notes by the trumpets and timpani. This German augmented sixth chord finally resolves to the cadential 6/4. In the comments section of one of my prior videos, someone convinced me to stop notating this as a tonic chord, since it really functions as part of the dominant chord. But in this specific case, I'm not sure how else to point out that it's a minor 6/4 in a major key. I love everything about this passage, including the timpani rhythm that emphasizes the return to the tonic and the entry of the orange transitional figure. More than almost any other Haydn passage, I think this one foreshadows the rhythmic drive and ferocity of the Beethoven symphonies. This intensity continues for the rest of the movement, but this wouldn't be Haydn without a humorous gag at the end, in this case a surprise timid return of the purple theme, before the forceful final bars. Now listen to this entire recapitulation section.